There are Israeli human rights groups such as B'Tselem which are willing to speak out against the occupation. If they are willing to do that, why isn't the Labour leadership willing to do that?
I think it's cowardly, to be honest. There's no other way to put it. The idea that, speaking up for the Palestinian cause is synonymous with anti-Semitism, deeply, deeply problematic. There's many Jewish people who speak up against the apartheid system. We've seen it from the human rights group that you've mentioned. And it's not mutually exclusive. You can be strongly opposed to anti-Semitism while supporting the Palestinian cause at the same time. And by blurring the lines between that, what does that say to a British Palestinian? That speaking up for your rights and standing up against your oppression is a form of racism. Is that not a form of racism against them?
Last week when Keir Starmer decided to pull out of an event because someone supported boycotting Israeli dates from settlements, do you think that maybe Keir Starmer is kind of a bit out of touch with reality?
Absolutely. What that individual did was he shared a post from Friends of Al-Aqsa, a Palestinian human rights group that defends the rights of Palestinians, that highlights what they're going through, and they'd asked the British Muslim community fasting Ramadan to avoid buying dates that were produced in illegal settlements. And let's take a step back and remember what we're talking about here. These settlements, the creation of these settlements is built upon the displacement of the Palestinian people, home demolitions, Palestinians being denied the right to their own land. That's a courageous stance to take, to say, no, we do not want to use and buy and purchase merchandise and dates from an occupied region. And I think Keir Starmer would find it very difficult to go to an iftar where they were serving dates from Israel. If you'd said to someone that this fruit was, taken from a place that's an occupied region, occupied illegally, by the way, under international law, I think most people say, yeah, you're right to be doing that. So I'm not sure why you would pull out of an event. I think it's very deeply offensive. This was from the Labour Muslim Network, a network that has highlighted repeatedly the vast Islamophobia present within the Labour Party, with 37% of British Labour Party Muslims members have witnessed Islamophobia. What message does that send to them?
Do you think there's a situation now at the moment where the Labour Party know that you're going to probably vote for the Labour Party anyway, a lot of Muslims are going to vote for the Labour Party anyway, because at least it's not the Tories? Keir Starmer knows that, Angela Rayner knows that, and they're just going to take you for granted.
I think it's already happening. So if you look at this Labour Muslim Network report into Islamophobia within the Labour Party, more than half of Muslim Labour Party members said they don't trust the leadership to tackle Islamophobia. If Muslim Labour Party members have no confidence in the leadership, how do you think Muslims who just vote for the party might be feeling right now? Muslims don't just care about foreign policy issues. Muslims live in some of the most deprived parts of this country. The Labour Party has been talking about how cutting the rate of corporation tax is a bad thing. I mean, who are you trying to appeal to here? So I think you have to be very, very ambitious. You have to be principled. You have to have some sort of vision. Right now, it feels Keir Starmer is almost very robotic, almost like 2015's kind of soft left Diet Coke version of the Tories, just nodding along. Oh yeah, the Conservatives did that. Oh, that's problematic, but we're not going to go further enough and criticise them. It's almost like they think just because the Conservatives are popular right now, we'll just nod along and we'll become popular as well. And that's just not how politics works. You have to actually stand for something. So I think a lot of British Muslims don't have that same enthusiasm. At least in my opinion, I've seen that they don't really have that same energy. I think 2017, that general election, a lot of people were turning out. Like, I was in my local college and we were signing up loads of people to vote. So yes, politics is about winning, right? And this is the one thing that the right likes to monopolize, on this idea that we can win. No, you can't. Look at the polls. You're compromising on everything and you're nodding away, and you think that's going to help you to win over voters. They will see through it. Voters are not stupid. And right now, as much as they would like to say, we're not opposed to the Palestinians, we're not opposed to the Kashmiris, people don't like wishy-washy politics. People want to know what you stand for. And right now, I'm struggling to see what Keir Starmer stands for.
I saw on Twitter, Jez Phillips use the term white working class. I've seen the media use that quite a bit as well. But if there's a white working class, why is there never ever mentioned a black working class or an Asian working class?
It's one of the most problematic terms, right? Because ethnic minority communities in this country are disproportionately working class. We never ever hear about the Asian working class in Bradford or Luton, or the black working class in Tottenham or Hackney. Why is that? They are disproportionately working class. Why are they trying to divide people along those lines? I don't understand it. And often when there is talk, even from the Conservatives, by the way, on the white working class, it's normally made in comparison to ethnic minorities, rather than talking about the central issue, which is class, which is the fact that deprivation creates a scenario where people have less opportunities. They want to focus on the white element of it, that somehow these people are disadvantaged because the government's focusing more. And this is what Liz Truss actually talked about, that we should stop talking about fashionable issues like race, when race and class have always been interlinked, right? Racial discrimination also creates a class barrier. We know that for a fact. We know if you have a Muslim name, you're less likely to get a job. There's studies being done on this. So I think it's an attempt to divide and rule, essentially. And class, I think, is a central issue. Are white working class people disadvantaged? Yes, but that's not because they're white, that's because of their class background. And I just don't think we talk enough about class.
Why do we only hear the term white working class?
I think it's a deliberate attempt to divide along. It's part of this whole idea of the culture wars, right? That somehow the interests of ethnic minority communities are very separate from the white communities, right? And they're really trying to play on that. But actually, if you break it down, and if you brought a white working class person and you sat them down with a Pakistani working class person, I guarantee you they'd find a lot more in common than the media narrative portrays. Just the other day I met someone, white working class guy, who was helping my uncle's van, who's, he's got a burger van, and he's from Bury Park, which is seen as like this no-go zone for white people, right? He's white working class, and he goes, I love Luton. He goes, this idea of the way Tommy Robinson depicts our town, it's horrible. Diversity is a good thing, multiculturalism is a good thing. But this idea of white working class people are all the same is deeply problematic. But also, like you said before, this idea of, if we see the progress of an ethnic minority person in television or in journalism or in politics, how many of those people actually come from a working class background? How many of them come from places like Birmingham or Bradford or Luton or Hackney or Tottenham? How many of them went to a state school? I fundamentally think class is like the most important thing and is often missing from all sorts of discussions. And yeah, I honestly think if we'd got together on that basis and spoken about issues through that rhetoric, we'd see a lot more change. I was watching a movie recently, Judas and the Black Messiah, which depicts the life of Fred Hampton. Fred Hampton, he was assassinated at the age of 22, and he stood on that basis. He went out to white working class communities, to the Latino communities in America, and he united them along that line. A huge aspect of that was community organizing. I don't think political parties are doing enough of community organizing, actually going out to communities, because a lot of these individuals in these parties, they don't live and breathe what working class people live and breathe. They don't see the issues we see every day, homelessness, bailiffs coming down to doors, people using food banks. How many of them have ever been to a food bank? So these issues that affect people from all walks of life, but particularly working class communities, they don't experience them themselves, right? And I think that's why we're seeing other ways to divide people. Because if it came down to, if class was the central lens in which we viewed things, I guarantee you the Conservatives would not have a majority in the House of Commons right now. But we've allowed this whole idea of culture wars. Look at these ethnic minority students who are trying to decolonize the curriculum. It's a threat to our unique heritage, when all they're asking for is, a critical understanding of history, right? But they have created so many moral panics about different communities, about the black community, about the Muslim community. And that's why we are in the mess that we're in. I remember there was a good analogy that I read somewhere. It was almost like you've got like a plate of cookies, right? And the establishment, the rich, they take all the cookies and they leave the crumbs, and then they say to that white working class people, look at that black person, look at that Muslim person, they're taking your crumbs. And that's what's happening. That's exactly what's happening right now.
The entire strategy now of the Labour Party is red wall, red wall, red wall. But do you think he's forgetting maybe other heartlands, in Bradford, in Manningham, in Tower Hamlets, in Hackney?
You have to remember, with every foundation, there's more than one wall, right? These guys are going to the red wall, and it's almost quite patronizing, I think. This idea of all the people in the red wall, all they care about is you waving an England flag and having a pint. No. You go to these constituencies and you see the levels of deprivation there. And by the way, and this might not be a popular point, but you know, that second referendum policy that Keir Starmer championed, it didn't sit well with those people. You know, whether we like it or not, in 2016, a majority of people on a 72% turnout, higher turnout than every single general election since 1997, voted to leave the EU. Now, I don't think every single one of those people voted to leave the EU because they were racist. I think it was, for many people, I can't speak for everyone, it was seen as a protest vote. It was seen as a way to punish the establishment, you know, and I don't think people have actually gone to those constituencies and really tried to understand their grievances. That's why Labour lost in 2019, because primarily they were wishy-washy on Brexit. Boris Johnson made that a Brexit election, and that's why they did so badly. In 2017, Labour was crystal clear on what they stood when it came to nationalising the railways, when it stood on that anti-austerity, very clearly an anti-austerity agenda, very clear support for the Palestinians, very clear support and solidarity for the Kashmiri people. But your point about, you know, forgetting other parts of the Labour heart, I think it's true. We never hear of places like Luton or Hackney or Bradford seen as the Labour heartlands. Why is that? Is it because they are ethnic minority communities there who have no alternative? Because we know, for example, the Conservatives have horrible Islamophobia. Do they think that Muslims just on that basis will have nowhere else to turn to, and they'll take our votes for granted? And I think that it's not just the red wall that is collapsing. I think in the ethnic minority communities right now. So for instance, when Keir Starmer said that, so Jeremy Corbyn had actually said that he stands in solidarity with the people of Kashmir, right? I think the vast majority of British Pakistanis in this country actually come from the Kashmir region. Keir Starmer turned around and said, look, it's a unilateral issue. I'm not going to take sides. 100 British mosques said they're going to vote to boycott the Labour Party. So it's not just about people switching parties, it's about people not bothering to actually go out of their way to vote Labour. You know, I've canvassed for the Labour Party. I've knocked on doors for the Labour. I've given money to the Labour Party. If the Labour Party is not going to stand for my interests as a party member, then whose interests is it going to stand for? You have to talk to people outside of the election cycle. You have to say to them, what do you need help with? What are you doing to, you know, educate people? What are you doing to organise when you have trade union disputes, when you have people protesting on issues like Black Lives Matter? If you call Black Lives Matter a moment, do you think black people are going to stand behind you? You know, if you say that, you know, we saw the vast Islamophobia in the Labour Party, and you say, you know, you're going to have swift and decisive action to tackle Islamophobia, and then we find out that David Abrahams, a property developer who's made a series of Islamophobic comments in the past, had donated, and you remain silent on that. Where's the swift and appropriate action? Where's the swift and appropriate action when Keir Starmer, you know, they found that 37% of Muslims in the Labour Party had witnessed Islamophobia, and it took you 2 weeks to give a proper statement, no apology, you know? Where was the swift and decisive action when the Labour Leaks report came out and James McBride, a former staffer, had said that Douglas Murray, who by the way has previously said that conditions for Muslims across Europe should be made harder across the board, he'd said that, I agree with Douglas Murray on the point that Muslims need to take a hard look, and that terrorism comes from Islam. That was a Labour Party staffer, and now what they're doing with the Labour Leaks, they're pushing it into the long grass, you know, they're kicking it into the long grass. Where's the swift and decisive action there? They don't really want that action because they think that Muslims will just come and put an X in the box and that's it, like as if we can't think critically and we can't change our minds. If you go to Glasgow, you know, back in the day people would say Labour could never lose in Glasgow, impossible. Now they're struggling in Glasgow, you know, because the SNP had managed to win those people over. You know, if you stand in the middle of the road, you're going to get run over eventually, right? So whatever you think about the Conservatives, right, at least you know where they stand, right? You know they don't like us, you know they don't like Muslims. The Labour Party's approach of, yeah, we love Muslims and, you know, we'll do our iftars with you, but don't worry about the Palestinians, don't worry about the Kashmiris, don't worry about the Yemenis. You know, Muslims have always had that sense of internationalism, the idea of a ummah, the idea that we care about Muslims around the world.
Do you remember last year when Joe Biden, he did that thing where he was like, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And there was rightful outrage against that because it's clear that kind of the Democratic Party, they take the black American voters for granted because they know, you know, at least we're not Republicans. Do you think the Labour Party, Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner are now doing a similar thing with British Muslims?
I think so, yeah. And, you know, even I think one of the best examples I can think of, when the EU referendum, right? A lot of people don't talk about this, but a significant proportion of British Asians voted Leave, you know, and some of them were questioned by liberals, right? Middle class liberals. Why did you vote Leave for? You're brown, right? As if they all think they in the same way, right? And we know what's better for you, right? And it's a very patronizing approach to politics. You can't win people over by saying, I know what's better for you, right? It puts people off from politics. When Joe Biden said what he said, I'm sure that put a lot of black people off from voting for them, right? And it's almost a sense of arrogance that you have nowhere else to go, so you're going to vote for me. What if people don't turn up to vote? You know, it makes a huge difference, people turning up to vote in key marginal constituencies. They need everyone's votes, not just the red wall constituencies.
I think so too. You know, when I was knocking on doors for the Labour Party, the real thing I found were people they just don't care about politics. They couldn't be bothered to vote, and the hardest thing was motivating them.
I think people do care about politics, not in the way that they want them to.
Yeah.
They want people to care about politics when it comes to putting an X next to their names at the ballot box. People care about what happens with their bin collections. People care what happens in their local community. People care about the fact that the libraries are closing down, and you know, the youth centres are being cut. And they care about all of these things. What they don't care about is people who are wishy-washy on the politics of it, you know. So I think it's about talking to people in their language. If you turn around and say to someone, oh, vote for the Labour Party, but they only see you a week before the elections, then they're going to think, well, you don't really care about our community. So the politics has to be rooted in working class communities. These people have to be on the ground. One of the best things Corbyn did was he established this community organising unit. I think that was a fantastic idea. You know, actually going outside of the ballot box and doing other things. That's what politics is about. It's not just about voting. It's not just about sitting in meetings or sitting in the House of Commons and debating. It's about the everyday reality. That's what politics is.
Do you think you might have a situation where maybe kind of new, maybe alternative parties which appeal to maybe minorities appear, and that will just kind of take voters away from Labour?
I think it can definitely happen. I mean, if you look at, you know, places like Tower Hamlets, we've seen like the Tower Hamlets First, I think it was called, and they took a considerable number of seats in council elections, right? And obviously, like nationally, there's the national picture, but locally there can be a whole host of issues. So, for example, in constituencies with a large number of Kashmiri voters, we've had this issue of brotherly politics, which is like clan-based politics, right? That the Labour Party has never really dealt with. And what we saw in Bradford in 2012 was Labour losing a very strong, you know, Bradford West with a significant Labour vote share, losing to a protest vote to the Respect Party because they'd taken that vote for granted. They'd assumed that regardless of whichever candidate we put in this seat, we're going to win this election.
You know, I think the Labour Party are making a real big mistake at the moment, because 2012 by-election in Bradford, Labour lost it to the Respect Party. You also had in Brighton, Green Party took a seat. You've had obviously the situation in Scotland, you've had Plaid Cymru. I could easily see a situation where Labour Party, they continue on this kind of centrist route. A million votes, 2 million votes go to a new party.
And you know what? That would be a disaster for Labour, because what that would mean is even if these smaller parties take about 5% of the vote, in marginal constituencies that means a lot. And it would certainly mean a strong, you know, Conservative majority. But then for you to then patronise those people and say, well, why aren't you voting Labour? You're giving the Tories a government, you know. You have to earn those votes.
Why is Keir Starmer not willing to stand up for the Palestinians, not willing to stand up for the people of Kashmir? Do you think that he's kind of trying to appease the kind of Islamophobic Daily Mail readers?
I think Islamophobia in general doesn't get the level of scrutiny it deserves. You know, a lot of people don't even think it's a form of racism. But we know, for example, in 2019, half of all hate crimes, religious hate crimes, were directed towards Muslims. It has a real impact. You know, what we saw in New Zealand, what we're seeing every day in Burma, what we're seeing to the, you know, the Muslims, the Uyghur Muslims in China, what we've seen in the war on terror, all of that was driven by this threat-based narrative of Muslims. And unfortunately, it's become so mainstream. And I think what's happening with the Labour Party right now is, it's not about principle, it's just about power.
Yeah.
It's not about trying to say this is what we stand for and we're not willing to compromise on this.
Yeah.
It's about maybe we can, you know, I think he wrote for the Daily Mail. How many times has the Daily Mail put on like this ridiculous headline?
Does that demotivate you? Do you think that would demotivate British Muslims to vote Labour because Keir Starmer's written for the Daily Mail?
Definitely. This is a paper that frequently demonizes the Muslim community, and there is a link between media portrayals of British Muslims and hate crime. There's been studies done on this, right? So for us, Islamophobia, Islamophobic hate crimes, attacks on British Muslims, they don't come out of nowhere. It's not like people just automatically decide to hate Muslims one day. It's a slow, gradual process. The media plays a role in that, but also, when British political leaders see Islamophobia and don't take it seriously as an issue, what message does that send to the rest of society? If we know, for example, that 57% of Conservative Party members have a negative view of Muslims, that 37% of British Muslims have experienced Islamophobia, and these issues have not been dealt with in the mainstream political parties in British society, then what hope is there that these political parties will tackle it in the rest of society?
I see a lot of people, BLM activists, people from the British Muslim community, they're complaining about racism.
Yeah.
They're saying there's a problem.
Yeah.
And the Labour leadership, they don't seem to care.
I think the best thing to illustrate this is the Labour leaks that were revealed last year. So these were the leaks into internal party staff conversations, and they found, strong evidence of anti-black racism. I think Diane Abbott was subjected to a lot of abuse. Muslims, I think there was one party staffer, James McBride, who talked about how it was difficult to disagree with Douglas Murray, who's previously said that, conditions for Muslims must be made hard across the whole of Europe. And he said it was difficult to disagree with him on the point that terrorism comes from Islam, and even so-called moderate Islam has hard questions to answer about terrorism. And what's happened to the Ford inquiry? Why are you kicking it into the long grass? What do you think about? And black MPs, Labour MPs, have highlighted this. I think there was a Huffington Post article that come out, and they've said you're not taking anti-blackness seriously. I've got black friends who've highlighted similar things, and they don't think the Labour Party represents them. And in the Muslim community, a similar feeling that the racism we experience is not seen as an important part of the Labour Party's agenda, and that needs to change, because how on earth are you going to, even Labour Party members, black Labour Party members, Muslim Labour Party members, if they feel disenfranchised, how are you going to manage to win people who aren't even in the Labour Party?
We have a situation at the moment where we've got rampant Islamophobia in the Tory party, the mainstream party of government. I mean, there was even a situation where the Britain First party called on its members to join the Conservative Party. Yet you see this not covered at all in the media. Do you think there's a situation where just the media think that the Muslim community just don't matter?
Well, either they think they don't matter or they don't really care, It's not like they don't know what's going on, The Hope Not Hate done a report, and they found that 57% of Conservative Party members have a negative view of Muslims. Nearly half believe that Islam is a threat to the British way of life. We've had examples of Conservative Party members calling for Muslims to be thrown off bridges, to be sterilised. Even the leader of the Conservative Party, Boris Johnson, he's got his own history of Islamophobia, what he said about Muslim women wearing niqabs. And we know after that there was a 375% increase in Islamophobic hate crime, so it certainly has an impact. But yeah, I think the media has failed on this issue. The Conservatives promised an inquiry into Islamophobia in 2019 by the end of the year. We're now in 2021 and we're still waiting for that inquiry. Where is it? And we also know that inquiry is likely to be a whitewash, because the advisor on the inquiry, Wazik, he said he wants to dump the term Islamophobia. So how on earth are you being advised on an inquiry into Islamophobia by someone who doesn't even believe in the term? The person leading the inquiry, Sarwan Singh, he believes, he's previously been held up for his views on Muslim victimhood. He's made comments in the past. So I think it's a complete joke, and even people in the Conservative Party who've been targeted haven't really been spoken to about this inquiry. But I think it speaks to a wider point about the media and its relationship to British Muslims. 0.4% of all journalists in this country are Muslims, despite making up 5% of the country. So why is it that it's racism against Muslims doesn't get that same level of scrutiny? Where is the Panorama documentary? Where is that Newsnight special on the widespread Islamophobia, not just in the Conservative Party, by the way, in the Labour Party as well? It's an issue that is mainstream across society.
What I remember was Nigel Farage on his Twitter account whipping up the most horrific hostility towards refugees, Yeah, what's his relationship to the media? LBC gave him a show for years.
Yeah.
LBC had Katie
That's how you do
Hopkins.
it. If you want to be famous in this country, just say something about Muslims. You'll have a book. It's an industry.
Do you think there's a situation where if you are Islamophobic, actually you'll go up the ladder in the media?
There's a book. It's called The Islamophobia Industry. You know, it talks about how Islamophobia is profitable, because let's remember that New Labour, a lot of the Islamophobia we saw in terms of government legislation, whether that's the prevent agenda, whether that's, you know, the mass surveillance, that was used to justify, you know, foreign wars like what we saw in the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War, and that relied on the dehumanization of the British Muslims, and that was Labour Party, remember. So the Conservative Party, they know that bigotry sells, it wins elections.
Do you think there's a problem now in British politics where both the Labour Party nor the Conservative Party really care about the lives of British Muslims?
But look at France. Macron is seen as this liberal who cares about human rights. He's been whipping up so much Islamophobia there. And why is it that the British mainstream media won't even cover something like that? So I think it's not just in Britain, it's across the world. It's in Europe, it's in India, it's in Burma, it's in China, it's all across the world. And again, it is that threat-based narrative, you know, having that person that you can blame, that scapegoat that you can blame, you know, it works, it's a strategy, it's a political tool, it's not just prejudice.
I feel there's a situation where we can talk about Russia, we can talk about Iran, Venezuela, these countries with horrible governments, terrible racism, terrible repression, but we don't seem to be willing to admit that right here, we've got terrible racism.
And I think the best way to illustrate this is on China. Why is it that Conservatives with a history of Islamophobia have suddenly started talking about the Uyghur Muslims? Do they really care about Muslims? Or is this more motivated by a trade war? And I think it's the second one there, because Sean Bailey, who's standing for the Conservative Party, he's talked about what's happening to the Uyghurs, but he's also been responsible for saying some horrendous things about British Muslims in the UK. So why the double standards, or why the inconsistency? They like to depict Islamophobia as something that's unique to China, when actually a lot of what China's doing, actually, they've learnt from the West. You know, so it's a global phenomena.
Do you reckon that the reason the media love to whip up Islamophobia, it's all about telling people, you know what, your enemies, it's not this policy cutting your benefits, cutting taxes for the rich. No, they want people to be angry at Muslims.
Yeah, it's scapegoating, right? It's sensationalism. You know, it drives, they actually profit from it. You know, the way the media works in this country is all about clicks, is all about outrage. They love it. They love divisiveness. It sells. In terms of policymakers, if the focus of communities is always about looking at immigrants. I remember 2015, the immigrant was always seen as the problem, in a similar way that the Muslim is always seen as the problem, or the Jews are always seen as the problem. And I think that's convenient for the establishment, because it means they let off the hook, because all that energy is focusing on those marginalized communities.